By 6 p.m., Carpathia took on a harbor pilot from Ambrose Lightship, and an escort of tugboats and private craft followed her, hooting and clanging into New York. At 7, heavy winds and rain started to pick up, and the flashes of photographers with their cameras speckled in the rainy dusk. By this time, Carpathia approached Staten Island to pick up the port physician Dr. Joseph J. O'Connell from the quarantine vessel Governor Flower. By 8:40 the ship had just passed the battery, and was now moving slowly up the North River past the Statue of Liberty. Even though they had no umbrellas, Jack, Rose, and Fabrizio went up to watch the city of Manhattan growing in size. They gazed up at the Statue of Liberty, looking partly bronze and partly green, welcoming them home with her glowing torch. It was just as Fabrizio saw it, so clearly in his mind. But Fabrizio didn't even bother to look. What was even the point without Helga by his side? Then the trio looked down at another sight, a rather unscrupulous one if you look at it that way. Reporters from the New York American press boat Mary F. Scully were shouting questions through megaphones. One of them actually boarded Carpathia, only to be grabbed by crew members and taken below. People on the smaller boats were holding up signs, asking for Titanic passengers by name. Jack Binns, a former wireless operator from another White Star liner, Republic, which sank 3 years ago, was looking forward to meeting Bride and Cottam. But for Jack, Rose, and everyone else, a different kind of ordeal was about to begin. Captain Rostron guided his ship towards the Chelsea docks, meeting the Merritt and Chapman tug champion on the way. An important delivery had to be made first. Since she carried too many lifeboats for Cunard's New York dock hands to warp her in properly, Carpathia's first stop was at White Star's dock rather than Cunard's. First, she had to unload the 13 Titanic lifeboats that she still carried on her own decks. These lifeboats were all that remained of the sunken Titanic. Souvenir hunters were quick to visit the boats, and within less than a day they had been picked clean of all fittings and supplies. White Star eventually removed the Titanic nameplates from their bows and moved them into storage. It was uncertain if the lifeboats were returned to service on Olympic or another liner, or simply retired. But Carpathia's crew was certain of one thing. The ship was dwarfed by the long pier that had been constructed with so much effort to receive the vast Olympic and Titanic. After the boats were tied and secured by IMM Dockmaster Osborne B. Thomas, Carpathia was on her way again, albeit at a painfully slow pace. Amidst thunder and lightning, Pier 54 was packed, with an enormous welcoming committee of 10,000 strong. They waited silently as Carpathia pulled into the pier. Waiting were friends and relatives of Titanic passengers, city officials, representatives from the coroner's office, uniformed doctors and nurses, stretcher-bearers, the immigration commissioner William Williams and his staff, and at least 20 ambulances and crews. Stretchers and blankets waited as well. Charitable organizations included the Salvation Army, represented by Ava Booth, Monsignor Lavelle with 10 Sisters of Mercy, and a committee from the New York Stock Exchange with $20,000 cash to distribute to the needy. The Boy Scouts were also there to provide aid and comfort for those without family. They even came with cash for those who had lost everything. A crowd of 28,000 people were spread out behind the police cordon. Only 2,000 of them held passes that allowed them onto Pier 54, and the rest were held back by the policemen. Reporters and photographers were everywhere, looking for a good story, eager to share this moment with the world. They were standing at the foot of the gangways, lining the tops of cars and trucks. It was the 1912 equivalent of a media circus. Back on board, as the crew opened the doors and the gangways that were connected to the ship's entrances, Rose covered her head in a plaid shawl that Miss Kelly had given her during the voyage, and Jack took Cal's overcoat, making sure that the extra money and the necklace were safe and snug in the pockets. With that amount, they could afford to build a house for themselves. They waited with the other steerage passengers to be loaded off, holding each other's hands, never letting go. At 9:35 p.m., the survivors disembarked. The Frauentals were the first to leave. They, along with the rest of Titanic's survivors, made their way down the gangplank and passed through the pier building. Some, like Harold Bride, could not move without assistance. Rebecca, having spent most of the voyage with Mrs. Abbott, would spend the rest of her childhood growing up under her care before settling out on her own. In later years, she would recall the man who saved her life as an angel amongst the many mortals of men. The first and second-class survivors departed, slogging in a long line that seemed like it would go on for more than 2 hours. Shortly before 11, the steerage passengers disembarked, Fabrizio being the first to leave. Jack and Rose, their prediction fulfilled, followed with a group of other steerage passengers, among them Katie Gilnag, Willie Coots, and the Goldsmiths. Willie never stopped to see Rose, for his mother was already longing to find a nice lodge on dry land. Once they were back on land, the two lovers were met by an immigration officer. "Can we take your names, please?" Rose was the one to speak. "Dawson, Rose and Jack Dawson." "Thank you." The immigration officer escorted the two inside for processing. They walked forward with the dazed immigrants. The boom of a photographer's magnesium flash caused them to flinch, and the glare was blinding. Rose and Jack were steered towards a holding area with Fabrizio, who was just as dazed as his fellow survivors, seated 3 seats away from them. But neither Jack nor Rose even noticed him. They were watching the other survivors being reunited with their friends and family. The crowd outside was jostling to see their faces, shouting the names of loved ones whose fates were still unknown. For every reunion that happened, many more never would. Madeline Astor, accompanied by her maid and nurse, was met by her stepson Vincent, a man slightly older than herself. He had originally hoped to take her off the ship at Quarantine Island in the family yacht Noma, but White Star officials had convinced him that it would be inadvisable. Edwina Trout was greeted by 3 cousins who presented her with a change of clothing and whisked her away in a rented car, skillfully navigating the crowded streets as they headed for Montclair, New Jersey. Carl Baer left Carpathia with Helen Newsom. His sisters and brothers found them and guided the couple to Baer's father, who seemed to have aged visibly in the last few days. Marion Wright, who had come across the Atlantic to be with her fiancé Arthur Woolcott, missed him in the crowd. She left the pier with fellow survivors Bessie and Bertha Watt, and did not meet Woolcott until the next day. They married the day after that. Alice, Mildred, and Sarah were met by Hudson Allison's brothers George and Percy. Miss Cleaver handed Trevor over to them and tried her best to avoid the press. She even went as far as saying her name was Jean. Mrs. Hayes left in a special train from Grand Central Station bound for Montreal, while the Thyers, Mrs. Widener, and her maid took the private rail route back to Philadelphia. The injured survivors were taken to the St. Vincent's and St. Luke hospitals. When Maggie was questioned on her survival by a reporter, she simply replied, "Simple brown luck, we're unsinkable." Ruth, Trudy, and Teresa went with Maggie and some of her friends to the Waldorf Astoria Hotel, intending to stay there for the night before heading back to Philadelphia. One of the earliest survivors to register there was William Sloper. The press descended upon him, and Sloper, who had already written an exclusive for the New Britain Herald, his hometown newspaper in New Britain, Connecticut, forcibly ejected them from his room. One reporter from the New York Herald had his revenge by publishing a story that Sloper dressed as a woman to escape Titanic. This piece of libel followed him for the rest of his life. One man who was there to greet the survivors was Senator William Alden Smith. This Michigan Republican had been appointed by the Senate Committee on Commerce to investigate the sinking of Titanic. He boarded Carpathia with a troop of U.S. Marshals, his secretary, Senator Francis Newlands, and a handful of subpoenas, one of which was for Bruce Ismay. The investigation's hearings would begin the very next day at 10 a.m., and Senator Smith wanted Ismay, along with Titanic's officers and some of her crew and passengers, to be there. To some, this had the same effect as putting them under arrest, which was not the kind of greeting they had expected. Smith was also looking forward to uncovering any possible corporate wrongdoing. Specifically, He was suspicious of the limited information that flowed from Carpathia's wireless shack in the days between her rescue of the survivors and her arrival in New York, hoping to find out from Bride and Cottam for reasons as to why the news was delayed. He was even going to seek testimony from Guglielmo Marconi, the inventor of wireless telegraphy and the employer of Bride and Cottam. The two even had a chance meeting with Mr. Marconi in the shack. Senator Smith also hoped to uncover evidence about preemptive insurance and stock maneuvers, as White Star and International Mercantile Marine brought time with an information blackout. As for our lovely heroes, Rose, tired of waiting, decided to slip away into the crowd, and Jack, without so much as a vocal objection, followed after her. There would be time to meet up with Fabrizio later. They pushed through the jostling people, moving with purpose, and none challenged them in the confusion. Then, with her taking Jack's right hand, they walked away from the Chelsea docks, further and further until the flashes and the roar were far behind them, and they were still walking, determined. As they walked, Rose thought to herself, "Can you exchange one life for another? A caterpillar turns into a butterfly. If a mindless insect can do it, why can't we do it? Was it any more unimaginable than the sinking of the Titanic? But no matter where they would go or what they would do, Jack and Rose Dawson would live happily ever after. But the story doesn't end there.